got it. What are we looking at today? So the agenda, we're going to have a quick introduction to today's speakers, then have our first speaker, and then have a look at net zero strategy and different types of carbon projects and carbon credits. Then we will have our next speakers and finished with our final guest speaker. And at the very end, we will have a Q&A and take all of the questions that you will have for our webinar today. So in terms of the speakers, I'm Luke. I'm the head of growth here at the Green Branch. The Green Branch, we are a certified B Corporation, also with the additional certification of Best for the World in terms of environment or Best for the Environment. And we're joined by Dan, who is from B Lab Benelux and the B Corp community. And we're super proud to be part of the B Corp ecosystem and really wanted to invite Dan along in terms of our audience who might want to know more about what B Corp is, but also understand B Corp and B Lab's position on the voluntary carbon market. So really grateful to have Dan as our guest speaker today. And on top of that, Miriam from the Green Branch, who is our forest carbon specialist, as well as Jacob, one of our co-founders, will be speaking as well. So, as I mentioned, we've invited Dan to come speak to us about the B Corp movement. So I'm going to pass over to Dan to begin with to give a bit of an introduction to B Corp.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke, and thanks for being here. It's great to see a B Corp of our within our Benelux B Corp community enlighten our audiences with well, more in-depth knowledge. And today it's also about the B Corp movement. So therefore, I would love to share a few things with you to all understand what B Lab is, what the B Corp certification entails, and what you as a company could do to take action to improve your impact. So I'm aware that most of you already know well, quite something about B Corp, so that's why I will keep it rather short. But if we go to the next slide, I would just love to quickly highlight that we are all very much aware of all the challenges we are currently facing. So we're facing a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, we're seeing human rights abuses in our supply chain, and on the other side, we're also throwing away 1/3 of our food, whilst around 2 billion people are suffering from hunger and malnutrition. In short, our economic system is broken, could be said. And that's exactly why B Lab is out there. And if we maybe press enter once again, we see our lovely mission, as B Lab is a non-profit organization that wants to change the economic system. What we want to do is move from a shareholder economy to a stakeholder economy. So we want to move from benefiting only shareholders to benefiting all. So what we do is we transform the global economy to benefit all people, communities, and the planet. For that, we create standards, policies, tools, and programs that shift the behavior, culture, and structure of business. For that, we mobilize the global B Corp community towards collective action to address society's most critical challenges, and we collaborate with governments, academia, coalitions, and other institutions to drive economic systems change. And you all know us from the certification work we do, but as said, we do much more. We also do lobby work at the EU level, for example, and many interesting campaigns, to just mention a few. But what does B Corp certification actually entail? So what does set it apart from other certifications, and what does it take to get B Corp certified? First of all, B Corps have to adhere to high standards in terms of environmental and social performance. So in short, a comprehensive impact analysis. Secondly, they have to change their statutes or their articles of association, better said, and lock the mission, lock their purpose into their legal structure, so to say. This is a very clear and very strict requirement, which is also a reason why not all companies want or dare to take that step, as it's really a commitment. Thirdly, B Corps in a community join a global movement of B Corps who want to use their business as a force for good. So it's not only focusing on your own individual impact, but also focusing on the collective impact. And last but not least, B Corps are obliged to recertify recertify every 3 years, and embed a kind of way of doing continuous improvement in their way of doing business. And if we then look at the next slide, we see, what our BIA, so our business impact and tool looks like. What we do is we measure what matters. So the B Corp impact assessment looks at success beyond profits. It measures your company's impact across 5 areas in terms of governance, workers, environment, community, and customers. And the company can self-assess for the threshold of 80 out of 200 points. And if it achieves these points, it can then decide to go for formal certification, for which B Lab starts a very extensive purification process. You might be asking yourself, why on earth would I start doing this? This takes so much work, it takes so much time, it takes so much resources. But if we then look at the next slide, you'll understand why. First of all, to improve your impact. It's a great tool to measure, manage, and improve your impact and make your business future-proof. Secondly, it helps to build relationships. Thirdly, it helps you to position your company as being part of a leading movement. Fourthly, I would love to elaborate on the fact that it helps attracting and engaging talent. Let's also not forget the way how it differentiates your company from competitors. And last but not least, how it helps to embed and lock your mission and protect it over time. Just to give you an overview of what our community looks like today, I would love to go to the next slide, where you can see an overview of the already more than 6,100 B Corps in our global community. You probably recognize a few of them. And if you go to the next slide, we see more Benelux-focused companies, including Tone Chocolonely, Rituals, The Body Shop, Ace & Tate, Alpen, Patagonia, Retransfer, Triodos Bank, and the Green Branch. And that's the reason why I'm also speaking here, because the Green Branch is a lovely member or player within our Benelux community. So that's what I wanted to tell today about B Corp and the certification, but I would love to chip in later on to also give B Lab's position on the voluntary carbon market. Thank you all. Let's switch back to Luc.
Well, thank you for your very kind words about the Green Branch. So yeah, I think very similarly to Dan in terms of where we position ourselves, we focus on restoring ecosystems. And if you look at what's going on around the world, so for example, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate and Community has highlighted that conserving and restoring natural spaces is essential for limiting carbon emissions, providing 1/3 of the mitigation effort needed in the next decade. But also, if you go back to the Paris Agreement of 2015, we want to keep emissions below 2 degrees, or at least to 1.5, or within 1.5. But as Dan said in his previous slide, we're really not on scope to achieve that. And recently, the UN Environment Programme released a report named The Closing Window, which highlighted that we're not on course to achieve the 1.5 degrees, and that actually, at the moment, our trajectory is about 2.8 degrees, and that only an urgent system-wide transformation can deliver the enormous cuts needed to limit greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And yes, as I mentioned, they've called it the closing window. But we at the Green Branch have a little bit more optimism, and we really want to work to keep the window open, and keep that window of opportunity alive. And there are 2 spheres within business that we think are very, very important, and where we concentrate our efforts on, in terms of net zero strategy and also nature-based solutions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those during this webinar today. But in terms of net zero strategy, it's really important that there are very clear guidelines and steps out there to follow to achieve net zero as an organization. And the first step starts with really understanding what your carbon footprint is. So it's really important in terms of when you're looking at your strategy, that you need to measure your scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So you know what they are, then you can create targets as to what you want to get to in terms of a decarbonization strategy. And that decarbonization strategy will include eliminating emissions through design, so designing products or having a service that emits less of a CO2 footprint, reducing through efficiency, and substituting through alternatives, maybe using renewable energy, for example. But there is a 5th layer, which is compensating. So there will be not the technology out there in order to go to zero. And that's where compensation and the use of carbon credits comes in, and we think plays a very important part of going above and beyond supply chain mitigation. So to go into that a little bit more detail. So this slide highlights what's happening, or what we'd like to happen, or what we suggest should happen at a company level. So you've got your company operations, you measure your CO2, you decarbonize, but then going this above supply chain mitigation, you can finance and support nature-based projects, and you can compensate your carbon footprint. And so from us, we are the Green Branch, we are a project developer of nature-based solutions. So what we do simultaneously, and what we want to happen at the same time, is that we identify degraded areas for sustainable restoration. We develop and implement planting design with the local community. We measure and capture carbon, and this is certified by a third party, which I'll talk about in less detail. But so that creates one certified carbon credit, which equals 1,000 kilograms of CO2. And so there's different types of carbon mitigation projects, and these can be put into avoidance and reduction carbon credits and removal carbon credits. So avoidance and reduction, essentially, this is where you'd be stopping CO2 from being emitted into the atmosphere. And you have nature-based solutions and technical solutions. So an example of a nature-based solutions would be a REDD+ project. And this stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And then you have technical solutions from renewables or cook stoves or clean water. And then you have removal. This is where you really are capturing and you're taking CO2 away from the atmosphere. And again, there's nature-based solutions and technical solutions. So from a nature-based solutions perspective, you've got afforestation, so ARR, afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation, and IFM, improved forest management, and blue carbon, which is carbon in coastal and marine ecosystems. So if we move on to the next slide, and as we highlight that key carbon credits are key to achieving net zero commitments. So we've got different types of examples of decarbonisation strategy. So on the very far left, you've got decarbonisation. So this is an organization that over time is decarbonising its efforts, but there's no offsetting and there's no additional efforts that are being made here. Whereas if you look at the next part, that's carbon neutral. That's where the organization is decarbonising over time, and through a mix of reduction credits and removal credits is becoming carbon neutral. The net zero example is almost the same, but is only offsetting their emissions from a removal perspective. And then climate positive is where you are actually removing and investing more in the removal of credits than you are actually emitting. And that would be defined as climate positive. And I think it would be naive here not to highlight some of the pitfalls and some of the biggest criticisms of the voluntary carbon market is this idea that it allows organizations to continue to emit and not have any decarbonisation strategy. But you'll notice that none of our examples here are static. You know, we strongly believe that organizations must decarbonize, and you can't just measure and offset exactly what it is. It has to be a progressional movement, and that's what we stand for, and that's what we want to promote within the voluntary carbon market. As I mentioned, we are a project developer of nature-based solutions, and one of our projects is in the south of Brazil, near Porto Alegre. This was an area that was completely previously deforested for cattle ranching. And we have a project that we are bringing it back to its original forestry state. And we have under 3,000 hectares under sustainable management, and we are contributing to 5 different SDG goals. But the project is also certified by Verra, which is an organization which certifies different projects within the voluntary carbon market. So we have VCS certification, as well as climate, community and biodiversity, which is CCB. And so this slide highlights a little bit about what we're doing. So the objective over the course of the project is to reach 10,000 hectares of afforestation, and that will sequester just under 4 million tons of CO2, and almost 7.3 million trees will be planted. But this is very sort of what I've just highlighted there is quite carbon focused. But for us, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we want to focus on holistic ecosystem restoration. So there are other benefits that we are implementing. So we will be planting 29 different species, which will give habitat for over 20 different native animal species. We are creating jobs for 250 employees, which will equate to 17,500 working days. And we invite universities and students from the local area to be able to study and understand our project in more detail. But to talk about that in a bit more detail and go into depth into what it really takes to develop a project and develop a project that really takes this holistic view, we've got Miriam here. So Miriam, I've had the pleasure of working alongside you and seeing what you get up to on one of our projects in Brazil. But I would love you to maybe talk to our audience a little bit and give them maybe a typical day in the life of Miriam.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Luke. I think I will tell you about my best day that I had in the past year first, as it just happened 2 weeks ago. We were in Brazil on project site and we were doing forest inventory, which means that we were measuring diameter, height of trees, determining tree species. And it was just incredible to see, the beauty of nature over there with all its diversity, but also that we can actually trust nature, that under the right conditions and with a little bit of help, forests will grow back super fast. So that was just super nice for me also to see and to experience. But to tell you a bit about a more average day in my life is that I'm working on different certification documents for the Verified Carbon Standard and CCB certification that you already mentioned, and also having meetings with, for example, forest consultants or university professors to help us in the planting design, and doing a lot of research on the forest types and species that we're planting.
Very, very interesting. And Miriam, I mean, on paper, it feels that nature-based solutions are great or a no-brainer. Why do you think they might have received some criticism, or could you maybe touch on that?
I think that it has to do a lot with the carbon tunnel vision. What I mean with that is that carbon credits are oftentimes just handled as another commodity without looking at the other impacts that carbon projects can have besides the carbon sequestration itself. So I think it's essential for us as project developers to really see the carbon market as a restoration mechanism rather than just producing as many tradable carbon credits as possible. Because we can have considered positive impact not only on the global climate, but also on the local level, on biodiversity, on communities on the ground that are directly affected by our projects. So to come back to the first part of your questions, I really think that nature-based solutions are a no-brainer. They're a great solution. It's just about how we implement, design, and manage our projects.
Okay, clear. And I kind of mentioned a little bit, or I sort of touched on some of the community benefits and some of the biodiversity benefits that we're doing as a project developer. How do you go about ensuring that they can be done, or what do you do to ensure that you've got this holistic project that isn't just about carbon?
So you just said it. Do not focus on only carbon sequestration and how you can design a project to have the biggest biomass growth possible. But really, I think the first step, and also the most important one, is to consider the specific conditions that your project is located in. So the area, the native ecosystems, you really need to understand that to design the project in the way that the local native flora and fauna can benefit from your project. So this means, for example, selecting the best fitting native tree species, making a sustainable implementation and management design. That's just key for the biodiversity impact, I would say. And of course, carbon sequestration is part of that. But you should see it in a bit of a broader sense. And then in terms of community, try to engage with everybody who's possibly affected, so individuals, but also organizations, from an early stage onwards. If you integrate them throughout the project development process, then you can already mitigate risks before they even happen. And you can most likely achieve positive impacts then, yeah.
And so that's quite from a sort of project development perspective. Some of the audience here will be thinking maybe about buying carbon credits. What advice could you be giving to that particular audience in looking for projects that really have this holistic impact?
So with the certification that we follow, the Verified Carbon Standard and the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standards of Verra, you can already get a lot of information of the different projects online. So for each project, there is a project design document, there is monitoring documents and all kinds of other certification documents published in the Verra registry. And I have to admit, it can be quite overwhelming at first glance. This is also why we at the Green Branch offer that service of checking quality of other projects for our clients. But to answer your question, I would say that the CCP certification is already a good indicator for higher quality projects, because then project developers already have to define indicators and also monitor them throughout the project lifetime in terms of their community and biodiversity impacts. And I can also give you some more detailed information from an afforestation and reforestation project type perspective. So what we are also checking is the type of species planted, if they're native or non-native, and whether they're planted in a monoculture site or not. Because there is a lot of projects out there that are monocultures with non-native tree species, such as eucalyptus. And for that, the positive impacts on biodiversity are quite limited. So I would really look for projects that are planting a diverse set of native tree species. And then, of course, also topics such as additionality and permanence are key for good project quality.
So I've attended a few webinars about the voluntary carbon market, and I often hear these words: additionality, permanence. What do they mean?
So additionality means that the project activities would not happen without the carbon finance. So I can give you an example. For example, the area is currently a degraded cattle ranch. Without the afforestation and reforestation projects, there would be no forest growing there, because cattle ranching has a long history and a big market for milk and beef, but there is no such business model for rewilding projects as we are doing them. So people would not grow native forests without the revenue of the carbon credits. And then you also asked about permanence. Permanence is about the lasting impact of the project. So therefore you can, for example, check if the forest is already designed kind of in a way to be harvested eventually, or to be well prepared for harvesting. As I already mentioned, the monocultures of non-native tree species. So eucalyptus timber, for example, has a big market in Brazil in the pulp and paper industry. So the likelihood of those areas being harvested eventually after the project crediting period is higher than in a mixed native species forest. Okay,
and maybe a personal question, like, so you've highlighted that the Green Branch can help organizations find, high quality projects or find the right project for them. On a personal note, in terms of your experience on the ground, how do you feel that your experience helps you sort of guide customers or help with that part of high quality credits, let's say?
Yeah, I think because we're a project developer covering everything from A to Z. So we're doing acquisition, project design, the implementation, as well as the monitoring and management. So we have the broad knowledge from that. We know pretty well which risks and benefits such projects can have. And also being in the field ourselves and talking to the people who are affected by the projects helps a lot to get an understanding for that. Yeah, and of course, as we're also undergoing the certification process, we know very well what the critical points are in terms of that.
Okay, and last question, bit of a holistic overview. What potential do you see with nature-based solutions? What potential do you see in this mechanism to fight climate change?
So I don't think the carbon offsetting is the silver bullet to solve climate change. And I would like to refer to the carbon emission mitigation hierarchy that you mentioned before. I think it's really the combined approach that is key. So of course we have to measure and reduce and optimize our processes to cut carbon emissions, but I think we should do it together with the offsetting. Nature-based solutions by themselves will not solve the poly crisis we're in, but they can contribute to fight global climate change. And as I already mentioned, they also can have a considerable positive impact on biodiversity and communities on the ground.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for joining us and sharing that really interesting insight. And to our audience, please remember that we've got this chat function. And so if you've got any questions, please just throw them in the chat and then we will take some of your questions at the end. So I can
Thanks,
move on now. You're welcome. So Jacob, hello. Thank you again for joining us. So you're one of the co-founders at the Green Branch. Can you maybe introduce why you started the Green Branch and what your vision was?
Yeah, definitely. So good to see all this face in this webinar. So I met Casper Kupman, my co-founder, during studies at the University of Rotterdam. And we found about the enormous climate crisis that we're in, and we wanted to do something about this. So we started looking into solutions to solve these problems. And there were a lot of technical solutions that we see coming up currently. That's very good. But we were more fascinated about nature-based solutions. And planting trees was one of them. And it sounds, well, fun to do, but also something that was needed. So we started to look into this market. How are these projects financed and how do they work? And what we found out is that there was no real business model behind it. There was most of the projects were running on donations, on NGOs, which is of course very good. But what we learned in our studies is that if you want to do something at scale, you need to have like a healthy business model. It has to be a business model for 30 years, which Miriam was also explaining. And during this deep dive into nature-based solutions, we found about the voluntary carbon market. And this really excited us because here two things came together. At the one hand, the tool to finance these projects, and at the other hand, also a tool for companies to start, well, take responsibility for the negative impact on planet Earth. So when we found out about this, it was for us very exciting, and we started drafting a pitch deck. I wanted to go to people to believe in our story. And on a very early stage, we found two investors that believed in this story as well. They wanted to do something with their next phase of career, and they really believed in the story of the Green Branch. But one thing that they said from the beginning is, if you're really serious about planting trees, if you're really serious about doing these kind of projects, you should go there. You should have the understanding of what it takes to do something on the ground there. So, well, they didn't have to say it 2 times. We went there, and I think we had some luck over time. We were in touch with a landowner that was interested in doing such a project. And well, after a year, our first tree, this is the picture as well, where we planted our first tree. And yeah, so this is actually how the Green Branch started. I think fast way forward, you already explained, we have now 3,000 hectares under management. And there's a lot of things in the pipeline. We have a very good understanding of how good quality project works. So yeah, exciting.
Well, thank you. And Jacob, you briefly touched on the element of the voluntary carbon market being a mechanism for organizations to take action. At the moment, where do you see, like, what are the requirements that organizations have in present day business right now?
Yeah, so I think that's very difficult. When we started the Green Branch, we were also looking to directives. How do you design a sustainable company? But at this point of time, companies only have to report on their financial performance. And I think what Dan said in the beginning, we should move away from a shareholder company to a stakeholder company, because there's so much more to do than only getting the financial returns. So yeah, at this moment, there's not very much regulations that do so. But yeah, B Corp, for example, helped us a lot in the beginning. We were B Corp, pending B Corp from the beginning, but it gives us a toolbox how to design such a company.
And do you see any initiatives coming up in the future, or any change that will kind of direct organizations to take more action?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think voluntary, there's happening a lot. Where we see that consumers are asking for it from companies, and also a lot more people want to be B Corp or follow these guidelines. But also on the government level, there's things happening. I think one of the most exciting things is the corporate sustainability reporting directive that is just announced by the UN, by the EU, and also these similar regulations are coming up in America, where companies have to start reporting on something more than only financial reports. So, what is your impact on biodiversity? What's your impact on climate and people? And this is just the beginning. This will become more and more over time. So yeah, I see positive change here, definitely.
And in terms of positive change, and we've sort of touched upon this in this webinar in terms of a good net zero strategy, how do you see that, or what recommendations can you give to those that are watching today and thinking about what their net zero strategy should be?
Yeah, so I think every company has a different net zero journey and also responsibility towards, well, offsetting, but their net zero strategy. And I think what is already mentioned twice this webinar is that we should start with calculating the footprint, know what you're emitting, and start reducing as fast as you can. But where I want to add is also, we should also start calculating with cost for carbon, also start offsetting as much as you can from day one. We talk to a lot of companies that say, well, yeah, first we're going to calculate, and then we're going to reduce, and then we're going to offset after that. But that's, I think, then you're hiding, besides this narrative, you should do as much as we can because we're in a crisis. And I think, yeah, so the responsibility part is something different. So calculating and making a strategy to get to net zero is a company's responsibility. But some companies have a high emission per euro earned, and they have to invest a lot in reducing their emissions, more than, for example, a software company that with some small changes can reduce where they can, and then don't have to do too much anymore. And that's the responsibility. When do you start offsetting what? And I think that every company has to understand that we're in a problem and that you have to do as much as you can. So yeah, you should invest in high quality nature-based solutions and offset projects. Yeah, from the beginning.
I totally agree with that, and I think to touch upon that in terms of investing, as you sort of mentioned, you know, I think the voluntary carbon market can also be used as an incentive to decarbonize more. You know, the more you decarbonize, the less voluntary carbon credits that you would have to invest in. So I think that's really true. And last, I asked Miriam a big holistic question before I finished. So one for you. The Green Branch is 3.5 years old. What's the future for the Green Branch, or what's your vision, your future vision for where we're going?
You know what, to end the webinar, Luke. No, I will keep it short, but I think it's super exciting what you have done in 3.5 years. And where when we started, there was only questions. Yeah, why should we offset, and what is the offset worth it? And there's a tremendous change already in the past 3.5 years. So it excites me a lot to think about the future, what will come up. I think that we are in a great position with a very good understanding of how projects work. So at the one end, we will work a lot on expanding our current project, but also new projects in Brazil. And at the other end, also help clients and corporates, well, getting their net zero strategies. So I think that's in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jacob. And yeah, stick around for, I've seen some questions come in, so stick around. We'll ask you a few more questions, but I want to pass across back to Dan now for an understanding of B Lab's position on the voluntary carbon market. So I'll pass it back to you, Dan.
Super. Thank you so much. Of course. So as you all know, B Lab as a certification body, we also have a clear vision on the voluntary carbon market and offsetting in that regard. So if we then look at the next slide, I would love to give an overview of the challenge which we currently face in our global system. Because while voluntary purchases of carbon credits by companies can play a role in supporting faster emission reductions and delivering of the SDGs, a system to define and ensure standards for both the integrity of the credits themselves and how companies can claim them is not currently yet in place in a good manner. So as a result, too many companies are currently engaging in a voluntary market where low prices and a lack of clear guidelines risk delaying the urgent near-term emission reductions, which are totally needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, as you all know. But luckily, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which can be abbreviated by ICVCM. I mean, don't even start knowing that on top of your head, but it's good to know that. They are currently working to define a transparent, high integrity standard for measuring and assigning the greenhouse gas equivalent credits that can be claimed. Besides, I also want to mention that the important work of intensifying, recognizing and rewarding high integrity companies who purchase and retire carbon credits to go further and faster in their climate action is being shaped by the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. So another abbreviation, which can be actually mentioned like VCMI. The same holds true for the SBTi guidelines, of course. In short, a transparent, high-integrity framework is needed to ensure credits are only used once the company's own mitigation efforts are in line with science. And in that regard, I wanted to share our perspective on the voluntary carbon market. So if we then go to the next slide, we see how we as B-Lab look at the voluntary carbon market and what we advise you to take into account when setting your own business up and setting your own strategy up for success. So first and foremost, companies should work on decarbonization, as we have all already stressed during this webinar. So companies should follow science to establish their greenhouse gas reduction targets. Secondly, companies' climate transition plans should consider, here comes a rather technical term now, consider beyond value chain mitigation action, which is a term which has been coined by the SBTi initiative, or broadly actions for the wider society. So this could also be linked to climate justice, for example, and can be, but does not necessarily need to be, in the form of carbon credits. Therefore, supporting high integrity carbon credits as a beyond value chain mitigation action is definitely a good way to go, so it's accepted. But credits cannot be counted towards a company's interim emissions reduction. So that is really key in that essence, to not count it towards a company's interim emissions reduction. So here again, it's good to know that depending on the context of the company, there can be also other actions which are positive for wider society, such as contributing to the economic development of regions where companies are operating, or including just transition elements like skills development for vulnerable communities, for example. Once the company's net zero target is achieved, well done, we should all get there. It can use voluntary carbon credits for permanent removals to counterbalance residual emissions. So it's important to know that companies do not have to use offsets for the residual emissions. They can do as well other investments in removals too. So if credits are used, they should be high integrity. So that's extremely important because there are so many credits out there. They should all be high integrity. Then, of course, the question rises then, what is high integrity? What are high integrity credits? So in SBTi, and also in the latest ISO net zero guidance and the latest UN high-level expert group recommendations, there's a guidance for that. So I'll invite you to take a look at them. It's super interesting. Read through them, read through those recommendations, read through the general takeaways. And in this regard, I wanted to elevate one aspect, which is that credits should be governed inclusively through participation and consultation of experts and the people and groups impacted by them, and particularly indigenous peoples, local communities, and vulnerable groups, such as women, children, elderly people, and people with disabilities. And when talking about carbon removals, it can indeed be in the form of nature-based solutions, geological or hybrid. So if done right, nature-based solutions is considered as a way to address both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So it's literally two things in one go. And this was also a big topic at the recent COP27. So nature-based solutions can have the advantage to contribute to both adaptation and mitigation. nature-based solutions are especially critical for the forest land and the agriculture sectors, of course. And if we then go to the next slide, you see something which I wanted to highlight, because last but not least, when talking about nature-based solutions, I want to highlight this quote from WWF, which says it all for me. Meaning indigenous peoples and local communities have used nature-based solutions for millennia. So it is crucial that all solutions are people-centered, led by communities, and draw from traditional and local knowledge. So nature-based solutions must be inclusive, transparent, developed with respect to land rights and respect to local people's views, and the benefits should equally be distributed. In that regard, you can also take a look at the IUCN MBS guide, which I've also referenced on this slide, which will of course be shared with you all after this webinar. And you might be asking yourself, how does that then look like within our certification? So in that regard, I just wanted to share our approach, our current approach in our B impact assessment, which rewards and incentivizes companies who use offsets or credits. But it's good to mention that our current standard does not give a clear imperative for what should be prioritized, meaning emission reduction versus offsetting. However, as you might be aware, we are currently revamping our standards, as we actually do once every few years. So we're currently in a consultation process, and we have now developed our new draft performance standards, which will go into force in 2024. And in our new performance standards, the emphasis is on emission reduction, obviously. So credits would only account for the residual emissions. And for most companies, this means that this will be around below 10% of its total emissions. In addition, companies are encouraged to, and actually large enterprises are forced to take climate action for the wider society, as I just touched upon before, and especially around topics of climate justice and just transition. And the form of that can be in credits, but it's not limited to that. So in short, we are seeing increasing strict standards, and that's also why we are taking them into account in our new upcoming performance standards. So this is actually what I wanted to share in terms of what our position is here at B-Lab. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, because we will now start with the Q&A part of this webinar. And if you have more, let's say, standard specific questions on B Corp, also feel free to email me directly. So I will make sure to drop my email address in the chat as well. But I would love now to go back to you, Luke.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, I really appreciate it. So yeah, now we've moved on to the Q&A part. So I've been sort of jotting down some questions. So Miriam, there's a question to you, which is, how are you dealing with the certification in terms of monitoring verification reports for carbon credits issuance? So after how many years of planting do you start the monitoring, and then what's the frequency that you carry out monitoring and audits?
So in terms of issuance, we're expecting to do the first issuance after 3 to 5 years, when the trees are big enough to be measured. But monitoring already starts right after implementation. We're doing different types of monitoring, some on a daily basis, monthly or yearly basis. And to give you some examples, so the daily monitoring involves our local workers to check the fences that no livestock is entering our areas and trampling our tree seedlings. And then we're also doing seedling survival monitoring. After 3 months after planting, we also do that on a regular basis to, if necessary, do replanting. And then what else do we have? Yeah, the measuring the carbon, as I said, happens when the trees are big enough to be measured. Yeah. And it's every how many years? Sorry, in terms of repeated activity from a yearly basis from certification perspective? Yeah, so the first time after 3 to 5 years, and then every 5 years we will do the issuances. That's the plan. Okay.
Then Jacob, I've got quite a short question for you. We highlighted one of the projects that the Green Branch develops. Someone has asked, who owns the land area that is being afforested? Well, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Yeah, this differs per project. There's a lot of different types. So there is where I do it on governmental land. We do it in partnerships, but also some areas that can be acquired by a fund that is dedicated to restore forests. So this is but this differs per region, per country, per project.
Okay, super clear. Then I'm going to go to you, Dan. I've got a question here. It says, how does B-Lab incentivize companies who offset their carbon emissions? Oh, I think you're on mute as well.
Yeah, sorry. But for me, the question was a bit vague. So incentivize to do what exactly? Because the question is incentivize to reduce.
So I think it might refer to maybe one of the parts. It says rewards and incentivize companies who use offsets and credits in one of your slides. And then the question says, how will B-Lab? So I think it's asking maybe a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, so it's good to know, and it's good to mention that we have the B impact assessment tool. So this is a tool which then allocates points to a specific impact pillar, and to receive those points, you have to fill in questions on a specific topic. So a very important part of the BIA is focused on that part. So you basically receive points for adhering to these standards or not. And if you don't adhere to these standards, it's way more difficult to certify. So that's how we try to really encourage companies to take that into account. And that's how we reward and incentivize companies to use offsets or credits. And of course, it's, as I mentioned, in our new performance standards, this will be even taken into a more stringent approach, really forcing companies to first focus on reduction, and then as a second element, of course, also take other elements into account, like offsetting.
Super clear. Okay. Miriam, I'm going to go back to you now. I've got a question that says, planting trees is very different from planting forests. How to include all aspects of biodiversity in reforestations?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And yeah, as we already mentioned before, we are really trying to plant resilient forests that resemble the native ecosystem as good as possible. And for that, we're working together with local forest consultants, also the universities that already did research on that. And we're selecting nurseries that really grow those seedlings from the region that actually are the best fit. So we're trying our best to resemble native ecosystems, and therefore hope to have the best impact on the local biodiversity too.
Okay, thank you. And Jacob, I had a question here that was highlighting that it's from Belen, saying that their organization is already carbon positive. And how do you see this within the market, and what's your view on organizations that are carbon positive?
I hope you picked this question because I think it's a very good one, and you're doing a great job there in Argentina with already being carbon neutral and being carbon positive. I think it's again the responsibility for every company what they can do in their power to offset. But if we look at the future, I think there will be incentives on governmental level to be carbon positive. If you, well, I spoke about financial reporting. There's other types of reporting coming in. I think a next step will be that there is well, tax systems that can incentivize companies to work towards these kind of well, strategies. Of course, this is an expectation. This is not something set in stone, but yeah.
Okay. And I'm going to move across to Miriam now. We had a question that highlights, how do you engage local stakeholders in your projects?
So we're looking at main organizations operating in the area, talking to those, going kind of from top to bottom, and then via those doing kind of snowballing and doing stakeholder mapping, to then also go down to the households and doing household service. So we're trying to to integrate everyone the best way possible. Yeah, also having like meetings where we invite everybody to present our project and also discuss with them, get their feedback. So our doors are always open, and I think and hope that we're communicating that in the right way.
Brilliant. And Jacob, tough question for you. We've had a question from James that says, can a growing business achieve net zero by reducing the carbon intensity of products? So, you know, as it gets bigger, how can it deal with what we're talking about today, or how can it get involved in the strategy of net zero strategy, even if it's growing?
Yeah, so how to make claims about this is a kind of a complex question, and regulations like SBTi have ways to do so, but there's definitely ways to, at the one hand, increase your grow your company. On the other hand, also take responsibility in the best way you can. But this is, of course, a bit more complex than having a mature company.
Okay, I've had so Jacob, I'm going to stick with you. I've had like 2 questions that are quite similar, asking about. So someone was talking about what about reforestation programs or regeneration programs in Europe, and particularly Belgium. And what can you say about that from a Europe perspective? But also someone's asked the question, which geographical regions are best for reforestation? So keen to get your opinion on that.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of difficulties here, and this is also why we should not treat carbon as a commodity, because there's different costs and different aspects of every project that there is. But we should restore everywhere. I think if you look at the best possible regions in terms of carbon growth, well, you have, of course, the belt, like Indonesia, Central Africa, and also Brazil, where there is the climate is very good to do such projects. And I'm meaning the climate as in carbon levels are used for a lot of carbon per year. So that's why it's more difficult, for example, in Belgium or the Netherlands to plant trees, because, well, prices of land are higher, and also the carbon uptake is lower. So this is something that is at this point very difficult, and I think also a midterm challenge that we have to overcome as a market. Okay.
I think I'm going to got time for just maybe 2 more questions or 1 more question. So we'll start with this one. So Miriam, this one's for you. We've got a question about leakage. So where ARR happens in place where cattle grazing is the baseline, how is leakage monitored, considering that people may have to move their animals somewhere else with potentially reduced space, and how is this monitored over time?
So in our case of our projects, we're working together with big landowners that own multiple farms. And it was this way that the landowner took the cattle, part of the cattle he took and replaced to an already existing cattle ranch. And when we talk about cattle ranches in Brazil, they're huge. Like the one that we now planted was 2,500 hectares, I think. So there's enough space for the cattle also on the other farm. And part of the cattle was brought to the slaughterhouse. So we're well informed about those processes. That's also super important for the certification itself, that we are aware of what happens to the cattle and that we're reporting and monitoring the leakage. So we are in touch with the landowner, and we have reported and documented evidence for what happens to it too. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm gonna last question, Jacob, to you. Someone has asked that the costs associated with registering, validating, and verifying projects in the voluntary carbon market is a major barrier to smaller scale projects. How can you get around this issue?
Yes, it is. And that's very difficult as well for us in the beginning, because you have to do a project at scale already. What we do know is that I think with the new innovations, okay, guys.
Yeah,
look, are we alive?
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, my screen went on black. So no, this is an issue, and it was also when we started the project. We had to do it at scale from the beginning. Was a good thing, of course. But there are there's movements on the market. So I think what will lower the cost of such projects tremendously is when we introduce the use of technology. Now everything is done with field measurements. That's also, of course, a good sign of quality because you get checked on in person. But we can also be more efficient here if we adapt technology in the certification process. Other things is that there's also other certifications coming up, like Plant Vivo, that are designing project designs for smaller projects. So I think time will solve this as well, but it's still something difficult. Yeah.
Okay, well, look, unfortunately, we've got very little time left. So what we do, we have recorded this session. So we're going to share the recording with those that have participated. And I've noticed there's a couple of questions that we haven't had time to answer. So in our communication back to you, we'll make sure that we give the Green Branch view on some of these questions. But for now, nothing else to say, but thank you very much for joining. If you have any follow-up questions that you didn't put in the chat or would like to get in touch with the Green Branch, my details are here, so l.james@thegreenbranch.nl. So please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. But yeah, nothing else to say, but thank you very much for Dan for joining us, and then our speakers, Miriam and Jacob. And there, I'll close it down there. Thank you so much.